February 14, 1976, 03:47 hours. Beneath the frozen perimeter of Tempelhof Air Base, West Berlin, a Soviet military engineer named Yuri Antonovich Belov lay motionless in absolute darkness, listening to the hydraulic whine of an American C-130 taxiing overhead. The vibration traveled through 23 feet of compacted earth and concrete, through the timber supports he'd installed himself, through the wool of his filth-caked uniform, and into his chest cavity where his heart beat at 42 beats per minute, the resting rate he'd trained himself to maintain during the 187 days he would ultimately spend in what GRU operational files would later designate as Object Crot 7, the deepest and longest duration subterranean penetration of a NATO facility during the Cold War. The tunnel measured 1.2 meters in height, 0.9 meters in width, and stretched 127 meters from its concealed entrance in the basement of a Kreuzberg tenement building to a terminus directly beneath the base's signals intelligence hub. Belov had been inside for 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. He had not seen sunlight since August 1975. He had not spoken to another human being in 142 days. His last hot meal had been consumed on October 9th. His orders delivered in a sealed packet before insertion and committed to memory before incineration were explicit: remain in position until the Americans discovered him, until his health failed completely, or until GRU headquarters transmitted the extraction signal via a dead drop system he could access without surfacing. None of these conditions had yet been met. What the Americans didn't know, what their counterintelligence apparatus wouldn't discover until a KGB defector named Oleg Gordievsky mentioned it in a 1985 debriefing, and what wouldn't be partially declassified until 2003, was that Belov wasn't there to plant listening devices or tap communication lines. Those operations had already been accomplished by earlier, shorter duration teams. Belov's mission was something the Cold War intelligence community had never attempted at this scale. He was a human seismograph, a living sensor package tasked with creating a comprehensive acoustic and vibration signature map of American military operations that could only be compiled through continuous long-term subterranean observation. To understand how the Soviet Union came to bury a man alive beneath an American airbase for half a year, you have to go back to the peculiar logic of Cold War Berlin, where the city's division created what intelligence historians call a pressure cooker environment, a 480 square kilometer zone where NATO and Warsaw Pact forces operated in such proximity that traditional espionage gave way to increasingly desperate and innovative penetration attempts. By 1975, both sides had exhausted conventional approaches. The Americans had their Berlin Tunnel of 1955, the legendary Operation Gold that tapped Soviet communication lines until betrayed by George Blake. The Soviets had their network of Stasi informants and technical surveillance teams, but the intelligence arms race demanded new methodologies, and the GRU's Third Directorate had developed a theory that the acoustic signature of military operations, the specific vibration patterns of aircraft types, the rhythms of personnel movement, the electromagnetic interference patterns of classified communications equipment, could be mapped with sufficient precision to predict operational patterns and identify vulnerabilities, but only through sustained observation from a position that eliminated atmospheric interference and provided direct coupling with the Earth itself. The theory was sound. The implementation required a volunteer willing to endure conditions that the GRU's own medical consultants predicted would result in severe psychological deterioration within 90 days and probable death within 6 months. Yuri Antonovich Belov was 31 years old when he entered the tunnel. His personnel file, declassified in fragments between 1998 and 2007, reveals a man systematically constructed for this mission. Born in Sverdlovsk in 1944, he was the son of a mining engineer who had survived the siege of Leningrad and a mother who had worked in the Kirov factory during the war. His childhood was spent in the Ural Mountains, where his father managed excavation operations for uranium prospecting. By age 12, Belov had logged more than 400 hours underground, accompanying his father into test shafts and exploratory tunnels. His psychological profile, compiled during his initial GRU recruitment in 1966, noted exceptional tolerance for confined spaces, abnormally low baseline anxiety response, and capacity for extended periods of solitary focus. His military service began with the Engineering Corps, where he specialized in underground fortification construction along the Sino-Soviet border. In 1969, he was transferred to a classified program training operatives for subterranean intelligence operations, a program that existed in the bureaucratic shadowland between GRU and KGB, funded through discretionary accounts and staffed by personnel whose official records showed them assigned to conventional units. The training was methodical and brutal. Candidates spent progressively longer periods in sealed chambers designed to simulate tunnel conditions: darkness, cold, humidity, isolation, and the constant low-frequency vibration of simulated overhead activity. They were taught to regulate their metabolism, to slow their heart rates voluntarily, to enter trance states that reduced oxygen consumption and psychological stress. They learned to navigate by touch, to identify materials and structures through vibration analysis, to maintain equipment in absolute darkness, and to endure the specific psychological pressures of knowing that rescue was impossible and that their survival depended entirely on their own discipline. Of the 47 candidates who entered the program between 1969 and 1974, 11 completed the full training cycle. Of those 11, Belov was selected for Object Krot 7 based on a final evaluation that noted his capacity to maintain operational focus during extended sensory deprivation exceeds all previous candidates, and his demonstrated ability to function effectively in conditions that induced psychological breakdown in other subjects. The selection was not an honor. It was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic precision and ideological justification. The tunnel itself had been under construction since March 1974, excavated in stages by rotating teams of GRU engineers working from the Kreuzberg tenement, a building the Soviets had quietly acquired through an East German front company in 1971. The excavation proceeded at an average rate of 0.7 meters per day, with all removed earth transported out in small quantities, disguised as construction debris from a fictitious renovation project. The tunnel's route had been planned to avoid underground utilities, to maintain sufficient depth to prevent surface detection, and to approach the target facility from an angle that minimized the risk of intersecting American counter-tunnel detection systems the Soviets knew existed because their own intelligence had identified similar Soviet systems and assumed doctrinal symmetry. The construction technique was medieval in its simplicity and modern in its precision. The tunnel was hand-excavated using short-handled picks and shovels, with timber supports installed every 1.5 meters. Ventilation was provided by a system of narrow pipes that ran back to the tenement basement, disguised as building infrastructure and fitted with baffles to prevent acoustic signature detection. The tunnel floor was lined with rubber matting to reduce footfall noise. The walls were packed with sound-absorbing material salvaged from industrial insulation. Every tool, every support beam, every meter of electrical cable had been selected and tested to ensure it produced no detectable electromagnetic signature and no acoustic anomaly that might register on American monitoring equipment. By August 1975, the tunnel had reached its terminus point, and the operational phase could begin. This required a different kind of specialist, not a construction engineer, but an observer capable of sustained presence in an environment that was, by any reasonable standard, uninhabitable. Belov entered the tunnel on August 1, 1975 at 0230 hours, carrying 180 kilograms of supplies, preserved food, water purification tablets, batteries, recording equipment, medical supplies, waste management materials, and a small library of technical manuals he had memorized but brought anyway as psychological anchors. He carried no weapon. He carried no suicide pill, though GRU protocol for deep cover operations typically included one. The mission parameters specified that if discovered, he was to surrender immediately and provide only name, rank, and service number, a decision based on the calculation that his capture would be less damaging than his death, which might trigger a diplomatic crisis and reveal the operation's existence to other NATO intelligence services. His orders were to remain in position for a minimum of 90 days and a maximum of operational tolerance, a deliberately vague phrase that left the endpoint undefined. His task was to maintain continuous observation logs, documenting the acoustic and vibration signatures of all detectable activity above him, to correlate these signatures with known American aircraft types and operational patterns, and to identify any anomalies that might indicate the presence of classified systems or operations not yet known to Soviet intelligence. The recording equipment was primitive by modern standards, but sophisticated for its era. A series of piezoelectric sensors mounted at different points along the tunnel's ceiling, connected to a multi-track analog recorder that Belov would manually operate in 4-hour shifts, 6 times per day. The sensors could detect vibrations in frequencies ranging from 10 Hz to 20 kHz, covering everything from the low-frequency rumble of heavy vehicles to the high-frequency signatures of electronic equipment. The recorder used a slow tape system that allowed each reel to capture 12 hours of data, with Belov responsible for changing reels, logging timestamps, and annotating significant events in a waterproof notebook, using a pencil and a small red-filtered flashlight that preserved his dark adaptation. The first 30 days were, according to Belov's own post-extraction debriefing, psychologically manageable. He established a routine: wake at 06 hours, conduct equipment check, begin first recording shift, eat 1 meal, conduct second shift, sleep for 4 hours, repeat. He marked time by counting the number of aircraft takeoffs and landings he detected, by tracking the patterns of personnel movement during shift changes, by noting the variations in activity between weekdays and weekends. He discovered that he could identify individual aircraft types by their vibration signatures, the C-130. Hercules produced a distinctive low-frequency rumble, the smaller C-47s a higher-pitched whine, the helicopters a rhythmic pulsing that he could feel in his teeth. But the human mind is not designed for this kind of existence. By day 45, Belov's logs began to show signs of deterioration. His handwriting became erratic. His time estimates started to drift. He would believe he had been awake for 4 hours when his watch showed 7, or vice versa. He began to experience auditory hallucinations, hearing voices in the white noise of the ventilation system, hearing music in the random patterns of overhead vibration. His body was failing in predictable ways. His muscles were atrophying from lack of movement. His skin was developing lesions from the constant humidity. His teeth were loosening from vitamin C deficiency, despite the supplements he consumed religiously. The GRU had anticipated this. The mission plan included a resupply protocol. Every 30 days, a support team would access the tunnel entrance, leave fresh supplies in a cache point 10 meters from the entrance, and retrieve Belov's completed data recordings and logs. The protocol specified 0 direct contact. Belov would wait at the far end of the tunnel while the exchange occurred, ensuring that if the support team was compromised, he would remain undetected. The system worked. Supplies arrived on schedule. Belov's data flowed back to GRU headquarters, where analysts were reportedly astonished by the precision and detail of his observations. But what the analysts couldn't see, what the logs and recordings couldn't convey, was the psychological cost. By day 90, Belov was experiencing what his debriefing would later describe as temporal dissolution. He could no longer reliably distinguish between sleep and waking states. He would find himself in the middle of a recording shift, with no memory of having started it. He would discover annotations in his notebook that he didn't remember writing. His sense of self was fragmenting, his identity dissolving into the mechanical routine of observation and documentation. The question that GRU planners had never adequately addressed was, what happens to human consciousness when it is deprived of all normal environmental feedback for months at a time? What happens when there is no day or night, no weather, no horizon, no other human faces, no variation in temperature or light or sound except the mechanical signatures of a military base operating overhead? The answer, which Belov's case would help establish, is that consciousness begins to cannibalize itself, creating elaborate internal narratives and hallucinations to compensate for the absence of external stimulation. By day 120, Belov had developed a complex delusional system. He believed he could hear conversations in English through the tunnel ceiling, though the acoustic properties of 23 feet of earth made this physically impossible. He believed he had identified a specific American officer who walked the same route every morning at 07:15 hours, and he had constructed an elaborate imaginary biography for this person based on the rhythm and weight of their footsteps. He believed that the ventilation system was transmitting coded messages from GRU headquarters, messages that only he could decode because he had achieved a state of acoustic enlightenment that allowed him to perceive patterns invisible to normal human perception. None of this was true, but Belov's logs from this period show a man desperately trying to maintain operational discipline, even as his grip on reality was failing. He continued to change recording reels on schedule. He continued to annotate his observations with technical precision. He continued to consume his rations in measured quantities and to maintain his equipment with meticulous care. The mechanical routines were holding him together, even as his inner world was collapsing. The Americans, meanwhile, had no idea he was there. Tempelhof's counterintelligence unit conducted regular sweeps for electronic surveillance devices, but their protocols were designed to detect active transmitters, not passive acoustic sensors. They monitored for unusual electromagnetic signatures, but Belov's equipment was entirely analog and produced no detectable emissions. They had ground-penetrating radar systems, but these were deployed primarily around the base perimeter, not beneath the central facilities where the risk of tunnel penetration was considered negligible. A miscalculation based on the assumption that no adversary would attempt something as logistically complex and strategically uncertain as a long-duration subterranean observation post. The assumption was wrong, but it would take a coincidence to expose the error. On January 17, 1976, a routine maintenance inspection of Tempelhof's underground utilities identified an anomaly. A section of drainage pipe showed unusual vibration characteristics that didn't match the expected signature of water flow or structural settling. The anomaly was minor, a variation of less than 3 Hz in the baseline vibration frequency, but it was persistent and couldn't be explained by any known system. The maintenance report was filed and forgotten, but a copy made its way to the base's engineering officer, who mentioned it in passing to a counterintelligence liaison during an unrelated meeting about perimeter security upgrades. The liaison, a captain named Robert Marsh, who had previously served with the Army Security Agency and had been trained to think in terms of adversary capabilities rather than known threats, asked a simple question. Could the anomaly be caused by something that wasn't supposed to be there? The question triggered a 3-week investigation that involved ground-penetrating radar sweeps, acoustic monitoring, and a review of all recent construction and utility work in the surrounding area. On February 9, 1976, a radar sweep identified a linear anomaly consistent with a void space running from the direction of the Kreuzberg tenement toward the base's signals intelligence hub. The anomaly was deep, deeper than any utility line had any reason to be, and it was geometrically regular in a way that natural geological features were not. The Americans had found the tunnel, but they didn't yet know anyone was inside it. The decision about how to respond was made at a level far above Tempelhof's command structure. The discovery was reported through counterintelligence channels to USAREER headquarters, then to the Defense Intelligence Agency, then to the CIA's Berlin operations base. The consensus was that the tunnel represented a significant intelligence opportunity. If the Soviets had invested the resources to construct it, they were likely using it for ongoing operations, which meant that surveillance of the tunnel might reveal Soviet operational methods, personnel, and objectives. The decision was made to monitor rather than immediately raid. Acoustic sensors were installed in the basement of the Signals Intelligence Hub, positioned to detect any activity in the tunnel below. Surveillance teams were deployed to watch the Kreuzberg tenement. The plan was to wait until the Soviets showed their hand, until personnel entered or exited the tunnel, until equipment was moved, until something happened that would justify a raid and provide actionable intelligence. What the Americans didn't anticipate was that Belov was already inside, that he had been inside for 6 months, and that he had no intention of leaving until ordered to do so. For 27 days, the Americans listened and watched. Their acoustic sensors picked up faint sounds, the mechanical click of recording equipment, the occasional scrape of movement, the rhythmic pattern of what sounded like breathing or possibly ventilation system operation. The sounds were irregular enough to suggest human presence, but not definitive enough to confirm it. The surveillance teams watching the tenement saw nothing. No unusual activity, no personnel entering or exiting, no equipment deliveries. The stalemate was broken by Belov himself, though not intentionally. On March 7, 1976, at approximately 14:20 hours, he experienced what his medical evaluation would later classify as a severe hypoglycemic episode brought on by the cumulative effects of malnutrition and metabolic stress. He collapsed while changing a recording reel, striking his head on a timber support and losing consciousness. When he regained awareness, he couldn't later say how much time had passed. He found himself disoriented and unable to remember where he was or why he was there. In his confusion, he activated his emergency signal device, a small battery-powered transmitter designed to send a distress pulse to the GRU support team. The Americans' monitoring equipment detected the transmission immediately. It was brief, less than 2 seconds, but it was electronic. It originated from inside the tunnel, and it confirmed that someone was there. The raid was authorized within the hour. At 18:45 hours on March 7, 1976, a joint team from Tempelhof's security forces and the 66th Military Intelligence Group entered the Kreuzberg tenement, secured the building, and descended into the tunnel. They found Belov approximately 40 meters from the entrance, conscious but severely disoriented, lying beside his recording equipment in a pool of his own waste. He did not resist. He provided his name, rank, and service number. He said nothing else. The medical team that extracted him noted that he weighed 52 kilograms, down from his insertion weight of 73 kilograms. His skin was covered in fungal infections. His gums were bleeding from scurvy. His muscle mass had deteriorated to the point where he could not stand without assistance. His psychological state was described as severely dissociated, with evidence of prolonged hallucinatory experience and possible permanent cognitive impairment. The intelligence haul was unprecedented. The Americans recovered 187 days of acoustic recordings, thousands of pages of handwritten logs, and a complete set of technical manuals describing Soviet acoustic analysis methodologies. More valuable than the data itself was what the operation revealed about Soviet intelligence priorities and capabilities: that they were willing to sacrifice personnel in long-duration operations, that they had developed sophisticated acoustic surveillance techniques, and that they viewed the Cold War intelligence competition as a zero-sum game where any advantage, no matter how small or how costly, was worth pursuing. Belov was transferred to a U.S. military hospital in Frankfurt, then to a CIA facility in Virginia, where he underwent months of medical treatment and debriefing. The debriefing was complicated by his psychological state. He was cooperative but often unable to distinguish between actual events and the elaborate hallucinations he had experienced during his isolation. Interrogators had to cross-reference his statements against the physical evidence from the tunnel and the data in his logs to separate fact from delusion. The Soviets, for their part, said nothing. No diplomatic protest was filed. No demand for Belov's return was made. As far as the official record showed, Yuri Antonovich Belov had never existed. His name appeared on no public roster of GRU personnel. His family was told he had died in a training accident in 1975. The operation was buried so deeply that even the KGB's first chief directorate, the foreign intelligence arm that normally coordinated with GRU on Berlin operations, claimed to have no knowledge of it. Belov himself was eventually repatriated in a quiet exchange in 1978, traded for 2 low-level American agents who had been arrested in East Germany. He was not returned to active duty. He was not publicly acknowledged. He was assigned to a military sanatorium in the Crimea, where he spent the next 7 years undergoing treatment for what Soviet military psychiatrists diagnosed as operational psychosis with chronic dissociative features. The question that haunted American intelligence analysts was, what did the Soviets learn that made this operation worth the cost? The acoustic data Belov collected was valuable, but was it valuable enough to justify burying a man alive for 6 months? The answer, which emerged gradually through defector reports and declassified documents over the following decades, was that the value wasn't in the specific data, but in the proof of concept. Object Krot 7 demonstrated that long-duration subterranean observation was possible, that human operators could survive in conditions previously thought to be unsurvivable, and that the intelligence gained from sustained acoustic monitoring could provide insights that no other collection method could match. The operation also revealed something darker about the Cold War intelligence apparatus on both sides: that human beings had become instruments, tools to be deployed and expended in pursuit of marginal advantages in an ideological struggle that had long since lost any clear connection to the security interests it was supposedly serving. Belov was not a hero or a villain. He was a highly trained specialist who volunteered for a mission that his superiors knew would likely destroy him, and he executed that mission with a discipline and dedication that persisted even as his mind was disintegrating. The Americans learned from the operation as well. Tempelhof's security protocols were completely overhauled. Ground-penetrating radar sweeps became routine. Acoustic monitoring systems were installed throughout the base's underground infrastructure. Similar upgrades were implemented at NATO facilities across Europe. The cost of these improvements ran into tens of millions of dollars, a price the Pentagon considered justified by the realization that the Soviets were willing to attempt operations that Western intelligence had dismissed as impractical or impossible. But the deeper lesson, the one that intelligence historians would still be debating decades later, was about the nature of the Cold War itself. The Berlin Tunnel, the U-2 flights, the submarine cable taps, the satellite reconnaissance programs, and now Object Crot 7, each represented an escalation in the technological and human costs of intelligence collection. Each pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable risk, and each was justified by the argument that the other side was probably doing something similar, and that falling behind in the intelligence competition could have catastrophic consequences. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. The Soviets built the tunnel because they assumed the Americans had capabilities they needed to understand. The Americans upgraded their security because they assumed the Soviets would attempt more operations like this one. Both sides were locked in a competition where the primary driver was not actual security needs, but the fear of what the adversary might be capable of. Belov's fate after his return to the Soviet Union remains partially obscured. He was released from the sanatorium in 1985, reportedly improved but not fully recovered. He was given a small pension and a one-room apartment in Sevastopol. He lived quietly, working occasionally as a consultant for mining operations, never speaking publicly about his military service. He died in 1994 at the age of 50 from complications related to chronic respiratory disease, a condition his medical records attributed to prolonged exposure to poor air quality in confined spaces. His obituary in the local Sevastopol newspaper made no mention of his military service. It described him as a mining engineer who had worked on various projects in the Urals and Crimea. His funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people, none of whom were identified as former military colleagues. The tunnel itself was filled with concrete by American engineers in April 1976. The Kreuzberg tenement was quietly purchased by a West German government front company and eventually demolished in 1982. The site is now occupied by a modern apartment building. There is no plaque, no memorial, no public acknowledgement that anything unusual ever happened there. The recordings Belov made were analyzed by American intelligence for years. Some of the acoustic signatures he documented proved useful in identifying Soviet aircraft types operating in East Germany. Some of his observations about the patterns of American operations led to security improvements that closed vulnerabilities the Americans hadn't known existed. But the most significant finding was one that couldn't be quantified: that the human capacity for endurance in pursuit of a mission is far greater than anyone had previously believed, and that this capacity could be systematically developed and exploited. The GRU's acoustic surveillance program continued after Belov's capture, though never again with such an extreme deployment. Shorter duration operations were conducted at other NATO facilities throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s using the techniques and equipment that Belov's mission had validated. None of these operations lasted more than 30 days. None required the kind of psychological sacrifice that Belov had endured. In the end, Object Crot 7 stands as a monument to the Cold War's peculiar logic that the pursuit of marginal intelligence advantages could justify extraordinary human costs, that the competition between systems had become more important than the security of the people those systems were supposed to protect, and that the line between dedication and self-destruction could become so blurred that even the participants couldn't always see it. The question that remains, the one that Belov himself reportedly struggled with during his years in the sanatorium is whether the mission was worth it. Did the intelligence he collected justify the destruction of his health and sanity? Did it prevent a war or save lives or advance any cause beyond the abstract competition between intelligence services? The answer depends on what you believe the Cold War was ultimately about. Whether it was a genuine struggle for survival between incompatible systems, or whether it was, as some historians have argued, a self-perpetuating competition that created the very threats it claimed to be defending against. What we know for certain is that on February 14, 1976, at 03:47 hours, Yuri Antonovich Belov lay in absolute darkness beneath an American airbase, listening to the sound of a C-130 taxiing overhead, believing that what he was doing mattered, believing that his sacrifice served a purpose larger than himself. Whether that belief was justified is a question that history has not yet answered and perhaps never will. The files remain partially classified. The full extent of what Belov observed, what the Americans learned from his recordings, and what the Soviets concluded from the operation's compromise are still protected by secrecy classifications on both sides. What has been released suggests that the operation was considered significant enough to influence intelligence doctrine for both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, but not significant enough to acknowledge publicly a status that perfectly captures the Cold War's strange combination of high stakes and deliberate obscurity. In the vast archive of Cold War intelligence operations, Object Krot 7 occupies a unique position, too extreme to be typical, too successful to be dismissed, too costly to be celebrated, and too revealing of the human price of ideological competition to be comfortably remembered. It was an operation that worked exactly as planned and failed completely in its human dimension, a technical success and a moral catastrophe, a demonstration of both human capability and institutional cruelty. And somewhere in that contradiction lies the truth about what the Cold War asked of the people who fought it. Not just their service, not just their loyalty, but their willingness to descend into darkness and stay there, alone, until someone decided their sacrifice had served its purpose.